The shouting started behind closed doors. By the time it was over, nothing was behind closed doors anymore. That is the thing about a locker room when it finally breaks. The walls that are supposed to contain everything, the frustration, the blame, the conversations that never make it into any press conference transcript, stop doing their job. And what spills out is messier and more honest than anything a manager or a general manager would ever choose to say in front of a microphone. The Dodgers locker room broke this week. Not quietly. Not in the diplomatic way that professional organizations prefer when things go wrong, when carefully chosen words are used to describe difficult situations without actually describing them. It broke loudly. With raised voices and names being said and a manager who has won at every level of this game being pushed to a place that people close to him say they have rarely seen him reach. Dave Roberts was at his breaking point. And the two names attached to that breaking point were Kyle Tucker and Tommy Edman. But that is only where the story starts. Because before this was a story about a manager losing patience, it was a story about a team losing its way. And before it was a story about a team losing its way, it was a story about a decision so ruthless, so coldly calculated, that even the player at the center of all of it, the player whose presence was supposed to make everything easier, had quietly stepped back from it. Shohei Ohtani had walked away from the playoff cut conversation. When the most important player on your roster removes himself from the discussion about how to save the season, the situation has moved past difficult. It has moved into territory that doesn't have a comfortable name. Let's go back to where it started. The collapse didn't announce itself. That is the cruelest thing about a team falling apart in the middle of a season that was supposed to be different. It doesn't send a warning. It doesn't arrive with headlines that prepare everyone for what's coming. It arrives quietly, through a series of losses that individually feel explainable and collectively feel catastrophic. The Dodgers had been losing in ways that didn't make sense for a roster constructed the way theirs is. Not blowouts. Not embarrassments that could be attributed to bad nights and moved past quickly. The losses were close. Competitive. The kind of losses that are almost harder to process than the obvious ones because they arrive with the feeling that everything was right there, that the game was there to be won, and something, some decision, some at-bat, some moment, had let it slip away. Those losses accumulate differently than blowouts do. They don't just affect the standings. They affect the atmosphere. The way players look at each other across the clubhouse. The conversations that happen and the conversations that stop happening. The silences that develop in rooms that used to be noisy. By the time the shouting started, the silences had already been there for a while. Tucker had been struggling. That fact had been established. It had been discussed publicly, carefully, in the measured language that organizations use when they are trying to balance honesty with protection of a player they still believe in. The numbers were not what they needed to be. The adjustments that had been promised had not yet produced the results that had been projected. But what hadn't been fully visible from the outside was how Tucker had been responding to the internal pressure around those struggles. Not the public pressure. Players at that level are experienced enough to manage the public narrative around a slump without losing themselves in it. The internal pressure. The kind that comes from a front office watching closely, from a manager making lineup decisions that reflect concerns he hasn't fully voiced, from teammates who are trying to win and can feel the weight of what isn't working. Tucker had feelings about that pressure. Strong ones. And at some point in the week that would become the story of this Dodgers collapse, those feelings found their way into the open. What he said, and to whom he said it, and in what context, those details remain partially protected by the walls that still exist even in a locker room that has partially broken down. But the shape of his rebellion was clear enough to those who were present. He didn't think the organization had been fair. He didn't think the criticism being directed at his performance accounted for the environment he'd been placed in, the expectations that had surrounded his arrival, the lack of the adjustment period that any player moving into a new situation requires. He said so. Not quietly. Edmund's situation was different in its details and identical in its destination. Tommy Edman had arrived in Los Angeles with a reputation built on consistency. On doing the things that don't always show up in the box score but that winning teams cannot function without. His value had never been about dominant offensive numbers. It had been about reliability. About the professional's ability to make the right play in the right moment and then prepare to make it again tomorrow. That version of Edmund had been inconsistently present this season. The reliability that defined him had developed gaps. Small ones, the kind that are easy to explain away individually and impossible to ignore collectively. And the organization had been watching those gaps with the kind of concern that eventually stops being quiet. When Edmund pushed back, and he did push back, in his own way, in a register different from Tucker's but pointed in the same direction, it wasn't with volume. It was with something more difficult to manage than volume. It was with a calm, direct expression of disagreement that left no room for misinterpretation and offered no easy off-ramp for the conversation. He didn't think the assessment was accurate. He said so clearly. And then he waited for a response. Roberts was the one who had to provide it. Dave Roberts has managed this franchise through seasons that would have broken lesser professionals. He has navigated personalities and injuries and expectations and October failures in ways that required a specific kind of emotional endurance that not everyone in his position possesses. He has been patient when patience was hard. He has been steady when steadiness felt impossible. This week, the steadiness cracked. Not publicly. Roberts is too experienced and too professional to let the full weight of an internal breaking point show in front of cameras and reporters. But the people inside that organization, the ones who work close enough to him to read the difference between his public face and his private one, described something this week that they hadn't seen in the same way before. He was done absorbing it. Done absorbing the rebellion, done absorbing the excuses, done absorbing the gap between what this roster was capable of and what it had been delivering. The conversation he had with Tucker and Edman, not separately, but together, in the same room, with everything on the table, was described by those with knowledge of it as unlike anything that had happened in that clubhouse in recent memory. He didn't lose control. That's not who Roberts is. But he made clear, in terms that couldn't be softened or reinterpreted afterward, that the time for patience had an end and that end had arrived. The room was very quiet when he finished. And then there was the playoff cut. This is the part of the story that changes the texture of everything that came before it. Because the shouting and the rebellion and the manager at his breaking point, those are dramatic, but they are recognizable. Teams argue. Players push back. Managers draw lines. These things happen inside every organization that is competing hard enough for the losses to actually hurt. The playoff cut is something different. The decision being discussed internally, the ruthless, cold, calculated evaluation of which players on this roster would be part of the October picture and which ones would not, had apparently reached a stage of specificity that shocked even people who understood intellectually that these conversations happen in every front office every season. Names were being attached to outcomes. Not hypothetically. Not in the way that front office executives discuss possibilities in the abstract when the season is young and everything still feels adjustable. Specifically. In a way that reflected a conclusion already being reached, a determination already being made, about what this roster needed to look like when the game started to matter most. Tucker's name was in that conversation. So was Edmund's. And the fact that both of them appeared to be aware of it, that the specificity of the internal evaluation had become visible to the players being evaluated, explained everything about why the shouting had started in the first place. Ohtani's removal from the conversation was the detail that landed hardest. He had been consulted. That much was clear. The organization's approach to major decisions involves Ohtani in ways that reflect his standing within the franchise, his importance not just as a player but as the gravitational center around which everything else is organized. When decisions of this magnitude are being made, his perspective carries weight. But at some point in the process, Ohtani had stepped back. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of statement that becomes a headline. Quietly. In the way that someone removes themselves from a conversation when they have concluded that the conversation has moved into territory they cannot in good conscience continue to participate in. Those close to him described it as discomfort. A genuine, personal discomfort with the ruthlessness of the evaluation being applied to his teammates. Players he had chosen to play alongside. Players whose decisions to come to Los Angeles had been shaped, in part, by what he represented and the standard he set. Watching those players be discussed with that level of cold calculation was something he could not comfortably sit inside of. So he didn't. What happens next is the question that none of the shouting and none of the evaluations and none of the breaking points can fully answer. The Dodgers are still the Dodgers. The talent is still there. The capability that made this roster look like a championship favorite before the season started has not evaporated because of a difficult week and a broken locker room. Rosters recover. Teams find themselves again. Managers draw lines and players respond and organizations make hard decisions, and sometimes, out of all that difficulty, something better emerges. But something has been revealed this week that cannot be unrevealed. The Dodgers are not a team that is comfortably ahead of its problems. They are a team that has been caught by them. And the distance between where they are and where they need to be before October is not a distance that can be covered by talent alone. It will require something harder than talent. Something that can't be signed or traded for. Something that has to be built in a room where the walls are still intact. Right now, those walls are still being put back together.